All right, welcome back to the IATOS Aviation Network podcast. We're so glad everyone would come back and join us for another episode. I'm joined today, as always, by my co-host Drew Laughlin. How you doing today, Drew?
Hey, Pierce, going great. How about you?
I'm doing fantastic. We have an awesome guest with us today, courtesy of one of our board members, Mr. Curtis Wilson. A little shout out to him. Stan Regan, who's kind of bragging using his background of a beautiful log cabin in Montana. Stan Regan is a current FedEx pilot, has an amazing story of how God met him in his life through his aviation career, and he's here to talk about it with us today. How you doing, Stan?
It's a beautiful day in northwest Montana. No grizzly bears this morning, so all is well. We can just go about our lives and enjoy what we've got out here. So
That's awesome. No grizzly bears is something you can hang your hat on for the day, I guess.
it is. We'll probably get through the day. There's a good chance of that. So
Well, we're going to jump right in, Stan, with your early life and just tell us kind of a quick story. How did you get involved in aviation and how did you kind of catch the flying bug?
sure, I think that all goes back to even before the memories that I have. So flying for me, I grew up in Central Texas. Went to Lake Travis High School at a time when Lake Travis was this sleepy little town outside of Austin, and we lived in an airport community. But it predates that my dad was a Army helicopter pilot in the Vietnam era, and so my dad and my mom were always my heroes. We had a really tight knit family. It was kind of the five of us against the world. And my dad always would talk about that if the Army had had an aviation branch, he probably would have stayed in for a career. And then when and if that ended, he would go ahead and go do an airline career because his prophecy came true. The idea is you get a pretty good amount of money for very little amount of work. And, who wouldn't want to do that? So that was kind of his vision, I think. And when he announced that vision, I just always wanted to make my dad happy. So I definitely jumped on that and said, well, that's what I'll do too. If that was good for dad, that's what I would do. And he had a veterinary practice that he started in Lake Travis area. And so we were a veterinary family in Lake Travis where it was a little different than what you remember, Pierce. It was small enough that I knew everybody in the school. I knew their brothers, their sisters, and how many dogs and cats they had. So a little bit different than it is now. So that's kind of where it came from. And that was aviation right up until they made this movie in 1986 named Top Gun. You may have heard of it. I was 13 years old, and when I saw that thing, I said, yep, I found my calling in life. That's what I want to do. I want to go get on that cat shot and go off the boat, and that's everything I want to do, and I don't want to do anything else. That was the whole plan. So I think that from a propaganda standpoint, that was very impactful to a 13-year-old kid in Lake Travis.
Yeah, as it was for my dad as well, and I think most people's dads at that age. So, at this point in your life, kind of growing up, where was your faith walk in your life? You talked about having a close knit family. Was faith a part of that family?
Yeah, it was kind of the opposite, right? So the interesting thing about that is both my mom and my dad grew up. One was Catholic, one was Protestant, but they had kind of dysfunctional families, right? So they had all kinds of different issues going on, and I'll use the word religious abuse, right? So everything was church all the time, every day, go to church all the time. And because of that, and maybe with some social influences, what I wouldn't realize until very much later in my life, they raised us on Christian principles that would be very much consistent with the way that a devout Christian person would, but they never ever used that verbiage or lexicon. I call it Christianese, right? If you go speaking, talk about sacrificial atonement and the blood of Jesus washing you clean to somebody who has never heard any of that, it sounds like crazy talk. So my parents chose not to use any of that verbiage. Because of that, as a young person, I grew up thinking, okay, well, religion is for suckers. We do all the things that are, we're supposed to do, right and wrong, morals and ethics and all of that. And I had no idea that basis that I was being raised on was a Christian foundation. I just didn't know, I would say if I were to use it easy, we were creasters, right? Go to church on Christmas and Easter. And other than that, it seemed okay. I didn't really have any problem with religion, but it was definitely one of those things that it was not, I didn't have a spiritual part of my life at all, I would say.
So, Stan, when did you really start flying? And, you grew up in an airport community around aviation. You were super excited and, I guess sold whenever you saw Top Gun. And so, did you go to the military? Did you go fly there? Where did you start flying?
So I grew up in Lakeway, which has this short little, you guys know it, but it has this crazy little strip with power lines on one end and a cliff on the other end as you dive in over a hill with a hill in the middle of it. And it's probably, I don't know, it's probably one of the worst airports to ever learn to fly on planet Earth. It's certainly top 10. And of course, I learned to fly there. So it was a deal that I was too young to drive, so I rode my bike to the Lakeway Airport, got in a Cessna 150, and I started learning to fly right there. And I can tell you that's part of my story is Bernie Royko was my instructor. And my guess is that Bernie was probably 35, but when you're 15, he seemed like he was 110, right? He's just this old guy that's teaching me to fly, right? And so we get in a Cessna 150 and we take off, and he looks at me and he says, "What do you think of that?" Keep in mind, I've seen Top Gun, right? And I looked at him and I thought, my 10 speed goes faster than this. This is boring. Let's go do something different, right? And so I guess he kind of picked up on that. I didn't say any of that. But on the third lesson, we started doing spin training and I was hooked. I said, yes, this is fun. Let's do this some more. So I was definitely in it for the thrills. And that was kind of how it all took off from there. So I soloed in high school. But to answer the rest of your question, I had an idea that I wanted to go fly Navy. So I ended up in Navy ROTC at Texas A&M University. And that's kind of where everything changed for me, because I got there, and something you don't know when you're young, military goes through cycles, and my cycle was spectacularly wrong. So when I got to Texas A&M in the Corps Cadets, they were not looking for pilots, quite the opposite. They were shedding pilots like crazy. And another thing happened, there was a big scandal that happened called Tailhook, which was my freshman year at A&M. And I kind of knew right there that my dream was over. There was no way I was going to be in a Navy cockpit, and it was not going to happen. And that's where I really got to a point that I was completely lost. Like I told you, the backup plan was no plan, right? It was fly Navy and that's it. And when you're in that position, it's a pretty difficult person for a young person trying to go through college. And so I definitely recognized there and made some lifestyle choices and got in a little bit of trouble from drinking alcohol and things like that. But it was a tough time to go through and be in a position where your dream's taken away and there is no backup.
Yeah, looking back on that time and period, now that you are obviously a lot stronger in your faith than you were then, to someone that's listening that may be going through that phase where they're going through flight school or they're going through A&P school and they have a goal in mind and maybe some doors are closing and without them knowing it, God is kind of moving them in a different direction that they may not totally see or understand or frankly, be happy about in this particular moment. How can you look back on that and realize God was moving you in a different direction, in a good way, in a positive way for the future of your life?
So it's a great question. And I wish that I could answer the question that right now is when everything gets rosy and everything's wonderful and we have this great fix. The exact opposite happened. This is where faith enters. But what entered was a group of college students that were ex-seminary called the Aggie Atheists, had a debate with a bunch of guys in the university, which classically happens on university settings. It's been happening for 50, 60 years. And I'll tell the two of you, it was one of those that you go in, and at the time, when I went to A&M compared with Austin, A&M was in the Bible Belt, right? A very different experience than what I had growing up in secular Austin, which was Willie and Waylon and the boys. You know, it was not exactly known as a hotbed of Bible activity. And the Aggie atheists wiped the floor with the guys that were trying to share the gospel. And for a person that was bitter and all of those kind of things like I was, it was sort of this, okay, the verdict is in, Christ loses, this is all untrue. And my point to that is, it's where I say that what Bible says is what you seek, you will find. And I was seeking the bad team to win, and so that's what I walked away from. And that's one of the things that I look at, because I it's caused and changed how much I am as a Christian. I was surrounded by Christians all that time. Most all of them kept their mouths shut. They would go do their church thing, but their speech didn't sound any different than mine. Their activities weren't any different than mine. And then on Sunday, they were going to church. And it's what most pastors talk about, right? You spend an hour here in the church building, and then you've got 167 hours that looks like secular, normal, sin-filled life. How's anybody ever going to be attracted to that? They're just going to assume, well, you feel guilty, so you go Sunday morning. So I work very hard today to make sure that my speech, like Paul learning to speak Greek and speaking to the Greeks in a language that they will receive, a big part of what I do is make sure that without using those Christianese terms that might turn people off or scare people away that are running from God like I was, I make sure that they know, hey, this is an active part of what I do 168 hours a week. At least that's my goal and what I aspire to do. Because I do think it's the
That's
case, and
great.
it's
I
been
love
the
that.
case, and it's been the case in my life that what you seek, you find, right? So if I'm seeking things to run
Yep.
away from God, it'll be there. I mean, the world will fill you with that.
So Stan, then after you kind of started to interact with more Christians and you were living around Christians and had people around you, but who weren't really living that, um, or at least sharing that, I guess, then where did your faith move from there, and how is your career moving in that time as well?
So I wish that was the story. You know, I wish I could answer your question and say all of a sudden a big thing happened and the exact opposite happened. I graduated A&M. There was still no pathway to get to the military, and I still knew I wanted to fly, but we frankly did not have the funds, and flying was not going to happen for me. Um, so my folks, once again being my heroes, stepped in, and I'd graduated A&M. I'd started working at the animal hospital. So, you know, not what I wanted to do at all. And all of a sudden, my dad and my mom came forward and said, "Hey, if you'll finish your private pilot, we can give you a loan so you can go get all of your ratings and all those kind of things if this is something you'd like to pursue." And at that point, I was thrilled with that because I had no other directions and frankly didn't think that was a possibility. But it reinserted my folks as kind of helicopter parents, right? You know, I mean, the things that I should have done to stand up and be a man and begin to grow, they weren't happening because here's mom and dad coming to the rescue again. And one of my dad's clients was a guy named Curtis Wilson, who you guys have had a podcast with before and happens to have an active part with what's going on here. Well, he was an active part to me, and he was a mentor to me that I didn't know to seek, but that's the huge part of what needs to happen for Christ to flourish, in my opinion. You have to mentor and be mentored. You have to be able to give away what you've learned and also receive from people who are not your family and friends. And that's what Curtis did for me. He actually sat down and was going to give me a high performance endorsement at the Lakeway Airport so I could further my aviation career, really get it started. And he was a young pilot for Fedex, and he was working his way up. And I looked at him and I said, "How do I get where you are?" And he said, "Well, have you looked into accelerated schools?" And I said, "I've looked at this one called ATP, but it seems too good to be true. You know, they say they do in 90 days what other people do in 3 years." And he said, "Well, I went to TSTC in Waco with a guy who founded ATP. And if he says he can do it in 90 days, he can." And 2 weeks later, I enrolled in ATP, and the rest was history. I had an aviation career, and it took off like crazy. Again, Christ is still not part of my life. So now I'm kind of getting this feedback loop from the world that, oh, well, I don't need God. I can do this on my own, 67 days later, I'm a CFII MEI, and I'm off to the races. This is great. And that led me into a career that was fun. It was exciting. I got on with a couple of regional airlines as I started moving up the list. And so on May 10th of 2004, I was a recently married captain on a regional jet out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we had a trip where it was a 3-day trip, and the middle day got canceled. So I did what a lot of guys had done, which is I went out with a crew, and we went out and we went drinking all day and had a good time. Nothing big, no special craziness, anything like that. When the clock hit and it said, okay, you've got 10 hours until it's time to go to work, quit drinking, went back to the hotel, had a shower, and went back to work. And when I got to work, I got a breathalyzer test for a plausible or reasonable suspicion for alcohol. And sure enough, took that test, failed that test, and was consequently immediately terminated without recourse. No insurance, you're on the street, you are completely and utterly devastated. And I call that a Damascus Road experience, because it's something that you read about or you hear about happens in the papers. And if you do that, then this is 21 years ago, the consequence is if you're checked in ready to go to work and you fail a breathalyzer test, it's almost a universal, you're going to prison. You've broken the DOT, you have breached the trust of your passengers, and you're going to go to prison. And that's not what happened in my case. And there's reasons, and that's what led me to faith, was to recognize that's a guaranteed. That's really not debatable. If you do what I did, that's what happens. And that's not what happened with me. And I don't say that that led me to faith because it was easy. It was the exact opposite. What I realized right then was I was a pilot to impress you guys. I was doing that to make my dad happy. It was something that I'd kind of followed along that I frankly didn't really have a passion for. And when you lose that all at once, it makes you ask the question, well, then who am I and what do I stand for? And you begin to realize it's not a fun place to be 30 years old. You've been married for a month and you have no idea what you're going to do with your life and what the meaning of life is. It's a pretty desperate place of incomprehensible demoralization, is a word that we use in another fellowship. And that, I wish I could say that immediately led me to faith. It was about 2 years from there. I never drank again because I knew I never wanted to bring more shame to my family and my family name. But my career was over as far as I knew from there. I left aviation, had no idea what was going to happen. I got my licenses revoked and my medical revoked. And with an albatross like that around your neck, career's over. You're never going to fly for FedEx. You're never going to do any of the things you set out to do. And so what do you do at that point? You can either commit suicide or you can see what happens next. And fortunately, God worked through some other people in my life that did begin to talk about Christ, that did begin to talk about their faith life. And at this time, I didn't have that prior contempt that I used to have. All of a sudden, I was open, if you will. I was honest and open and willing to learn more about it. And somebody gave me a challenge, a guy named John H. He's a guy that came forward and he said, you have these strong opinions about religion being for suckers. Why don't you act as if Jesus is who he says he is? Why don't you read the Bible? Why don't you do all the things that we do who have found so much more richness, so much more enjoyment in life than you've ever found, and see if that works for you? And that challenge was exactly what I needed. And so I did that. And it was rather immediate when I look back on it. It didn't feel immediate at the time. You're crying, you're crushed, you're trying to figure out what you're going to tell your new bride. It's the most difficult thing you can ever imagine. And one of the reasons why I do things like this is because this is who I've become since. I want to make sure that people around me know where I stand and what my Christian walk is, because quite honestly, I look back on it and I thought I was surrounded all the way all the way back to middle school with people that knew about Christ, And they never said a word. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? And I think the answer is they're afraid of offending people. So I'm very much willing to offend people today with my lordship of Jesus Christ, and do so in a way that's tactful, right? Because if you just lead with it and you say, here's the Bible, and smack them, that's not real attractive, right? So that's really where it started for me.
So I kind of want to go back to a comment you made about being a pilot to impress other people and to maybe bring satisfaction to your dad. You know, that was where your identity lied, was in trying to please other people. And you said you didn't really know this wasn't a real passion of yours. After you go through that experience where, you know, the licenses get taken away and things are really rough, and just there's really no positives to look at of, oh, well, there could be a silver lining in this, you know, it probably just felt all bad. As you started to get around those mentors and get around people that were starting to lead you to faith, at what point did you start to realize your identity could lie in a savior and lie in your faith outside of a job or a Top Gun Maverick appearance or pleasing dad or anything like that? Where did the shift change happen to where you started to put your identity in Jesus more than anything you were doing or being?
So it says it in the book, right? You can love the world or you can love him, and you really don't have a choice. It's one or the other. So I have drawn from that God doesn't care one bit what I do for a living, what my vocation is. He really doesn't care. He doesn't care if I do something menial, if I do something amazing that changes the secular world, any of those kind of things. So when that happened, it was a very strange place. You know, I have these Christian men that are coming and saying, well, you have to surrender. And I thought, well, I'm totally defeated. There's nothing to surrender. You're going to offer me this chance now to surrender? Heck yeah, I'll take that deal. That works for me, right? I got nothing left, right? So when I left aviation, I did not expect to go back to it. But I mentioned those guys that were mentors, and one of them came forward, and I didn't realize it, but I was essentially on a 2-year job interview with a guy that owned a oil and gas company in Houston. He was looking to see, is Stan going to be the kind of person with integrity that we can count on? And he needed an aviation asset. And so it took about 2 years before he brought the subject up. But through this process, I've become a Christian. I've gotten baptized. My wife and I got baptized together. I got the joy of getting to lead my wife to Christ, to have a personal relationship as opposed to something that's just a sterile book, right? I mean, that was kind of the view that I had realized it, right? But it's not until you act as if God is real that you can begin to see the possibility that God not only works through me when I don't realize it, but he can orchestrate things. One of my favorite passages is Proverbs 20:16, and it talks about the fact that a man plans in his heart, but the Lord determines his steps. So if you don't come from a spirituality basis and you don't understand how God works, that he's subtle, right? He's that still small voice that goes by. You know, he's not in the wind like it talks about with Elijah in the cave. And so as you see the subtlety to it, you also begin to see the power of it. Well, that's what happened here. I ended up working in a situation where the owner of that company asked me to start an aviation department for them through my own company. They wanted it to be separated. I thought I would be a flight department for a gas company, and instead founded my own company and bought a King Air for them. And I started flying for them and hiring and bringing pilots on and doing all the things that a company wants out of an aviation department. So that ended up being a 10-year run.
So you've started a company. You've found how did you find your way back in aviation with getting your licenses back? And how did that process look like just from a practical standpoint?
Yeah, sure. So the process was, if you go through a revocation and you have a DOT failure, it's a pretty cut and dry process for those that don't know. There is a process that the FAA requires that is typically called HIMSS. It's the Human Intervention and Motivation Study. And so through HIMSS, there's a variety of things that are required to do that are incredibly robust. I mean, you have to get psychology clearance, you have to go psychiatric clearance, you have to go to inpatient treatment. It is a huge, daunting thing that, in all honesty, that was part of my leading to faith. Because I didn't have sponsorship of an airline, I had to create my own sponsorship, essentially. And it ended up being the case that the eventual head of the FAA, the Federal Air Surgeon, ended up being my AME. And so he's the one that sponsored me to get my medical license back, because he was convinced that I'd recovered from alcoholism and substance abuse, which is what you have to be able to hold a Class 1 medical. And so I did all of that, in all honesty, at first, because I thought it would be something I would want to get back to, feel like, I didn't want to be 70 years old and think, I should have gone and tried to get my licenses back. I didn't want to have that kind of regret in my life. And those coincigods, I call them, right? I love that word, coincigods. Those little things that happen for me to be able to get my license back, especially, it's not nearly as, there were no resources for people who weren't 121 scheduled airline pilots at the time. There just truly weren't. If your company, about half the companies at the time chose to terminate, and half the companies, if you wanted help, they would give you help, and they would give you kind of unlimited help. And today we do a great job with mental health, and we bring a lot of people back. But back then, it just wasn't going to happen. So the fact that this series of events, of things that were supernatural, I will say, allowed me to be able to progress and say, hey, maybe it's worth getting my ratings back. And that was kind of coinciding or parallel pathing with meeting this guy that had a oil and gas company, and he wanted an aviation outfit. But at the time, I wasn't pursuing it as a vocation. I was just trying to be honest, salvage what I could from the wreckage. I mean, that's really what my motivation was.
So, Stan, I'd love to go back to this, something that you said toward the beginning of your story, that when you were raised, your family raised you with Christian principles, but without a real relationship with Christ. And so through this journey of losing your licenses and then just going through this Damascus road and finding Christ, what would you tell someone who maybe has Christian principles and has been saved or hasn't been saved, but isn't really living their relationship and maybe hasn't experienced a real relationship with Christ? How would you say that that has really changed your life? And what would you tell someone else who maybe hasn't really experienced that relationship yet?
Sure. I think the thing is, I've come to learn that you've got to have what I call a three-legged stool. You have to have physical health, you have mental, emotional health, and you have to have a spiritual health. And if you don't have all three of those legs in your life, eventually you will fall just like I did. I don't say that to scare people. It's just the simple truth. And typically what happens, and certainly happened for me, you overcompensate in other ways if you don't have that spiritual side. And the reason is as simple as you're trying to do it on your own power. And for thousands of years, from every philosopher that's out there, the truth of the matter is you will eventually face something in this world, right? Solomon talks about it. In this world, you will have sorrow. You're eventually going to face something that's beyond your capacity to handle. That's exactly what happened to me May 10th of 2004. And I knew that day, regardless of what the consequences might be, and they were devastating, it was beyond anything I could handle or that my father could fix for me or anything like that. And because of that, you reach out for anything at that point. So directly to your question, I don't care if it's the loss of a spouse or loss of a child, or maybe it's a loss of a job. I mean, it's rather miraculous to me that I lost a job. Losing a job was enough for me to say, I cannot do this. You're going to have to do this. And I'm willing to get on my knees and find something bigger than myself. That's exactly what Christ wants. I mean, Christ wants you to do exactly that, right? He wants you to say, you're it. That's it. Whatever your direction is. And I think that's really difficult for pilots. Working with pilots now these last 20 years, for all of us, we tend to be people that think we're the one holding the wheel, right? Ask some pilot what he thinks about the song, Jesus Take the Wheel. Most of them are kind of wince a little bit, right? They don't like that idea. But of course, if we're not so literal about things, the truth of the matter is God orchestrates everything in life for my good or the good of someone else. And that's why I use, and I'm so open about my struggles and my troubles, because I think if you don't hear that, typically, if you know you're struggling with alcohol or drugs or something like that, the last thing most people want to do is come forward if they're in our profession. They know it means an interruption in a career. But few of them take the time to realize that an interruption in your career where you get healthy and well and discover a richness that you've never known with the fulfillment of Christ, that's a much better deal than just keeping the clock ticking and knocking out another year around the sun. So,
Yeah. I think the other hesitation for someone who's struggling is probably, just like you said, the pride thing and feeling like we can stand up on our own 2 feet without the help of Christ, without help from anyone else. Um, and so, yeah, I think that that's exactly right, that it's very hard for people in general, but especially in our profession, to come forward if they're having issues or they're struggling with alcohol or drugs or really anything else that could mean a hit to their ego and to their pride.
I think that's exactly right. I don't know that I would have accepted it that way, right? Because I had heard words that I thought I knew the meaning to, right? I heard this word sin that Christians would talk about, and I kind of knew synonyms. Well, that's a bad way to think, or I'm less than, or whatever. Well, it wasn't until I met a mentor that said, sin it's an archery term that means to miss the mark, right? The mark is Christ, and to live with him is pure joy. And if you don't do that, then you're missing the mark. And I don't care if you feel that with sex or drugs or risk taking or gambling or whatever, any type of sins, anything, or pride, any of those things that take the luster off of him and put it on myself. I mean, that's the very reason why Satan gets thrown out of heaven, right?
I'd love to move forward into faith. Stan that's found Christ, Stan that's married, and he and his wife are running together and moving towards the Lord in your personal life and in your professional life. I know you said earlier, answering a couple questions. Well, I wish I could say at this part of the story, things picked up and went better, but they actually kind of went south. At this point, after you've totally committed your life to the Lord and you're following the Lord's footsteps, you've gotten your licenses back. You seem to be running an aviation department or aviation company, which is, like you said earlier, almost darn near impossible from what you had walked through just a couple of years prior. How did that momentum feel, and how did that build your faith as you're walking with God and going, man, I'm living a life right now that a couple of years ago seemed impossible?
Yeah, I think part of the important part in this is for the guy that's a doubter that would look at a podcast like this. That's who I'm always thinking of, right? Because I was that guy. I was not the guy raised in church. What's exciting about being the lost sheep or being the person like Paul, and we see that throughout his biblical walk from there on when he gets struck blind and he's on that road to Damascus. If you've been lost and you become found, you have an appreciation of what the power is of this gift that you've been given. And one of the things that was a challenge to me, not to come back and go the other direction, but one of the things that was a challenge to me was I'm meeting these men that are spirit based. They are waking up in the morning, they're reading the word, they're doing prayer and meditation, they're reaching out to other people, they are surrounding themselves with people that are on a Christian walk every single day. 168 hours a week, because it's life and death if they don't. If they don't, they return to their old path. And when I'm around those people, they encourage me to do the same. I will say that it's important to say from then on in my aviation career, it took off. I mean, we ended up flying a wonderful operation. I was having a great time. I made far more money running my own company than I ever did. I was in the days that are a little bit different than now. My first regional airline job, I made $13,000 a year gross to fly an airplane 950 hours a year in a terrible airplane for passengers. It was a Metroliner. It was an awful airplane. It was 140 degrees in the cabin. It's a terrible deal. And I was thrilled to get that job. So those were the days that my generation kind of went through, and you're amazing to get a job like that. Well, when I started working with my own company, I made far more money than I've ever made in aviation otherwise. And for me, that was a nice thing, but it was really just, there's a Cajun word called lagniappe, right? That was just extra. It was nice that the good things were happening. And those are kind of things that were happening in the world, but they pale in comparison to how I felt about me for the first time. The ability to look in the mirror and feel good about me and be on a path that was my own, not trying to please others or other people. So it's the surrounding myself with other people in aviation that are in a similar walk, that we have a heart for reaching out for people that are struggling. And that's one of the things that we'll get to when we wrap up, I'm sure. But this is what I do. I field calls all the time from guys that I have no skin in the game in their recovery or their acceptance of Christ. And because of that, because there's no motive, I mean, the very same thing, if you're giving away your life, you get to keep it, right? That's what the word says to us. So I hope that as part of this, and you guys know the ins and outs of how the podcast works, but I welcome anybody who's ever struggling with this to call me personally, and you're welcome to put my phone number on the tag for the podcast, because that's what I do. If people hadn't done that for me, I wouldn't be here today. And there's a ton of resources today for people who find themselves in this position. And believe it or not, it happens a lot more than you might think. But we're happy to do that because it's what gives me life today. So.
Wow, that's awesome. How did you transition from that corporate setting into what you're doing now?
Sure. So I really, because of this, I ended up with a really fascinating run through aviation, right? Usually for those that may not be as familiar, they're new pilots, you usually do one or the other. If you get into the corporate world, you don't typically go to the airlines. And if you get in the airline world, then you don't typically go corporate. And so that ended up transitioning. I had my company for just a little less than 10 years. But then once you've got those hours and that time behind you, you're able to get other jobs. And I was really fortunate to do that. I got to fly with my best friend at the time, a guy named Louis, and he was a mentor that had been really helpful for me. And we got to fly out of San Marcos and fly a Falcon 50 for a retired Army colonel. And, from there it was on to a Challenger that I flew for a family. And it was surreal, right? We're taking the Challenger to Europe. We're going to spend a month in the month of July in Italy. Why don't you bring your wife? And here's a card, and try to keep it under €1,000 a day. It was surreal, right? Living in the you guys may roll like that, but that was new to me, right? So I got to do that in the corporate world. And then you guys both know Curtis. So Curtis comes riding along on his bicycle one day and stops in the driveway. And now it's been 25 years since that initial meeting. And of course, we were close friends from then on. But he says to me, he said, "Hey, this is about 5 years ago." He says, "You're getting a little long in the tooth, but you still got enough time. If you wanted to come to FedEx, I think we can make that happen." And once I did get into the track of professional aviation, that was all I wanted. I wanted to fly FedEx MD-11 internationally and fly the purple. That's all I wanted to do. And so through the hand of God and the tireless work of Curtis Wilson, he really worked, because, if you're in a 121 job and you've had a violation and a revocation, even today, it's a pretty long putt to be able to get in. And again, the coincidence of miraculous things that happened along the way. I mean, your competition for those jobs are former Blue Angels and astronauts and all these other guys. And yes, I had all the qualifications and all the type ratings and all those things, but you still think, I wouldn't blame them if they didn't call me when they've got so many qualified applicants. But as you both know, God works and moves through people. And when you're living a life and you're righteously doing the things that you can do, I'm not saying that it's a reward, but from my vantage point, sure, it's a reward. Of course we do it because life is better and more fulfilling and more meaningful, and you have a gift and a focus on others, And I get to participate in that when I'm doing that. And that's what transpired with FedEx. FedEx was willing to give me a call. And so now for the last 5 years, I've gotten to go to the whole other end of aviation. I get to fly a 681,000-pound airplane to Shanghai and just hang out in a 5-star hotel for 2 or 3 days. Guys complain about it, but from where I've come from, I feel pretty friggin' blessed.
That's awesome. That's so cool. I can't even comprehend numbers like that. I think both the airplanes Drew and I fly could probably fit in your fuel tanks. But
yeah.
So I want to transition a little bit over to IATOS and what we're trying to do. And, thank you so much for being involved. And we're so glad Curtis brought you to us. And Curtis, if you're listening, everyone here thinks you're like the greatest guy ever. So you can take that home with you. But one of the reasons we started IATOS is we wanted it to be an icebreaker tool for people that are people of faith that are operating in the aviation industry, whether they're pilots, mechanics, they're working at the FBO desk, or they're working in a dispatch office. We wanted it to be a symbol for people to say, hey, I follow Jesus and I'm a disciple of Christ. And if you're interested in that, this is a symbol that I can relate to other people with. You mentioned earlier about getting to mentor and getting to minister to other guys that you fly with on the job, where when they get in a plane with you, they may not know what they're about to encounter for the next couple of hours. What are some ways that you minister to people in your job and in your workspace? Number one, and number two, uh, someone that's within the IATOS organization, what are some tools that they can take away to spreading the gospel and telling the story of the good news of Jesus to people that are around them in their workspace?
You two have been led to do what's been done for thousands of years, right? The Christian symbol of the fish, for those that don't know, when you're under great persecution back in Rome, the Christian symbol of the fish was where two believers might walk up. And at the time, they were all shepherds and they had the walking sticks, right? So one guy would walk up and make one of the arcs, and the other guy would walk up and make the other arc, which made a fish, right? Because you're fishers of men, right? That's where Jesus is talking about with the disciples. Well, it was sort of this underground code to have a symbol to say, oh, okay, I can trust this guy. I can talk to Pierce because he knows the other half of the code, right? To me, that's what IATOS does. If you've got that and you see that bag tag or you see that shirt or that merch that you guys are going to be flooding the world with, because I have no doubt God's going to keep blessing this ministry, it opens the conversation. And what I've found is once I took the pressure off, one of the reasons why I was afraid of Christianity was I thought, okay, now I'm Christian. That means I'm going to be going to Africa and I'm going to be spreading the gospel in this village. And oh my gosh, that's a lot of pressure. And one of the guys that I was talking to at the time said, Stan, don't worry. We're pretty certain God's not going to use you in that way. Which was took my ego down a little bit, but his point really was, instead of the Great Commission, one of the translations in a couple of different translations of go ye therefore, there's another version of that, which is as you are going. And that's what I've chosen to do. That means as I'm going, I sprinkle my conversation with things that let it be known right up front, I'm a Christian and I love you and we're going to have a connection if you're a believer. And if you're not a believer, I'm not a Bible thumper and I'm not a preacher. And here I've been lost and I've been found. And almost always, God just blesses that. He just opens that conversation. But it does require me saying, I can't tell you how many flights I've been on with a crew of 4 of us going across the Pacific, and we're droning on for 12 and a half hours going down to Shanghai or down to Guangzhou or something like that. And you get 7 hours into a flight, and one guy will say to the other guy something about his church. And from there, the conversation totally changes. And that's the part that the IATOS mission does and that I have a heart for is that ought to happen in the first 20 minutes. And if the guy's really anti, you can read that and you can recognize that and say, okay, we won't talk about faith. And I usually let it be known, if you do want to talk about faith or you have questions, I'll do my level best to answer them, knowing full well it won't be me answering them. God will give me the right words that can just plant a seed, or if you will, put a rock in this guy's shoe that makes him think about, hey, he's not what I thought fundamental Christians were. And that's all it takes. It takes a difficult and very simple thing to just flavor your speech with words that people pick up on, because most people pick up on it really quick if you're different than just the normal person they know at the cul-de-sac,
No, not really. Stan, I just want to thank you so much for coming on here and telling your incredible story. I hope that your story is able to serve as encouragement for anyone who's listening who, we all will inevitably go through hard times. And I hope that it just gives people hope that, the Lord has these things planned for a reason, and that on the other side of these things, we will be um, much, much better off and receive more blessings than we could have possibly imagined if we just seek Him and if we just surrender our life to Him in the way that you did. And so I love what you're doing and being willing to help people who were kind of in your shoes and just be a mentor to them, and just being bold enough to tell your story and to live out this life of following Christ and sharing what Christ has done in your life in the way that you are.
Well, I thank you for that. I mean, you guys are doing an awesome thing, and it's incredibly impressive to me and others like me that you guys, so young, are willing to do what you're doing, because it's really uncommon and you do stand out from the crowd. And I know already, how and why you do what you do, because you guys get it. And it's exciting to see what you're doing and what it's going to continue to do through this outreach, because who knows where it goes from here. But I'm excited to be on the bus.
Well, Stan Regan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your story and giving us some tips to take into our daily life to spread the gospel. Would you lead us in prayer to conclude this episode?
I'd be happy to. Father, thank you for Pierce, and thank you for Drew. Thank you for the ministry and the outreach and the vision that they have for Aetos. We know that what we're supposed to do is simply be your hands and feet, to reach out and do the things that you've asked us to do. And that's to share that in this life we can have sorrow or we can have you. And we expect that you will always bless our speech and always be there for us faithfully as we go through these things in life that we face, that we don't know what we should do. We know that the answer, regardless of what the question is always you. The answer is always Jesus. And we thank you that you bless them to have this vision. We ask that you continue to grow this fellowship. Let it be a light that attracts people to you. And we continue to focus on that. We ask that you continue to strengthen and embolden this mission. Amen.
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 Awesome.
Thank you for that.